Our moderator tonight is Greg Dobbs. He also serves on our programming committee. Greg's a professional speaker on global affairs, the author of 2 books, and a journalist for almost 50 years, spending most of his time as correspondent for 2 American television networks. Greg's the winner of 3 Emmy Awards and the Distinguished Service Award from the Society of Professional Journalists. In 2017, Greg was inducted into the Denver Press Club Hall of Fame. Please give him a warm welcome.
Come on up with me. I'm Greg. John, go ahead. And he's John. First, I just want to explain something. When he says a journalist for 50 years, it began when I was a reporter in the maternity ward. Clearly. Now, thank you, everybody, for coming. And the empty seats, if you're next to one of them, you can sort of slap around the ghost not sitting in that seat, because the seats are set up commensurate with the number of tickets sold, and these are the people who wimped out. And you didn't. But it's understandable because it's a cold night. And we all celebrate that at a ski resort, but it's still a nasty, cold night. But somehow, as a journalist, and John is a journalist all his life as well, you find a way to make a connection. And on a cold night, you've come out to hear about something that might not be taking the shape of the Cold War as we knew it more than a quarter century ago. But nevertheless, in some ways, it could be compared to an oncoming Cold War once again, and that is the challenges the United States faces, the relationship between the United States and several nations in Asia. And if you don't think that there are nations in Asia that are intent on either replacing or at least matching the United States when it comes to global standing, when it comes to industry and agriculture and technology, intent on taking our place perhaps when it comes to the fields of culture and education, when it comes to diplomacy and creating alliances with other countries around the world. If you don't think that there are Asian nations intent on overtaking us, at least in their region, militarily, and even in space, then you haven't been paying attention. And what's more, when it comes to the real 500-pound, what did they say, 800-pound gorilla in Asia, and that is obviously China. How many of you, with a show of hands, how many of you would say that China is rising? That was a trick question. China's not rising. China has risen. And the reality is that in many ways, and you're going to hear about them tonight, you're going to hear a little more about them tomorrow night, in many ways, China has already overtaken the United States of America as a leader in some fields of manufacturing and agriculture and alliances and so forth. And that's why the title of this 2-night, we call it a double-header for the Vail Symposium, is The Rise of Asia in the 21st Century and What It Means for the United States. Now, the good news for America is that there are nations in Asia, major powers in Asia. They include Japan, they include India in Western Asia, it includes North Korea and even China, that there are certain forces that are possibly working against them, overtaking the U.S. in certain fields. And those forces could conceivably leave the United States in the leading position that it's occupied for decades. So tonight, that's what you're going to hear about. You're going to hear from and have a chance to ask questions of 2 experts, and then 2 more tomorrow night. As Chris told you, there will be an intermission between the first and second expert tonight, and once again the same thing tomorrow night, because we'll hear from one at a time. My guess is that you might walk away feeling, and I don't know what they're going to say, but I think you might walk away feeling a little uncomfortable. You might walk away concerned because some of the forces at work in Asia have nothing to do with what some would call the decline in America. Some of these are things that you can attribute to the rise of these nations with or without any American role. And those are things that we can't necessarily reverse. Because in Asia today, we have nations that we not long ago thought of as poor and backward, but that's not true anymore. Our first expert is John Pomfret. He not only long covered Asia and China in particular as a correspondent and Beijing bureau chief for the Washington Post. In fact, if I read it correctly, you were one of the first American students to study in China back in the day, and was in fact a Fulbright scholar there. He speaks and reads and writes in Mandarin, which is the standard language in China, although for the sake of this audience, I asked you to polish up on your skills in English, and I understand you did so. Okay. And so from all I told you, and he went to Stanford, not a bad school, although I went to Berkeley, so it's not the best school in California. He sounds like a smart guy, but do you see the brace on his leg? He's a skier, but he didn't hurt himself.
And I've come to Vail with a broken kneecap.
A broken kneecap, and it wasn't from skiing, it was from carrying the skis of his 10-year-old child, and evidently you were distracted, right? So you should have come to Vail, not Whistler.
No good deed goes unpunished.
But we make our kids carry their own skis
As
here,
you
know.
should, I understand.
So before you start your planned presentation, I want to ask you a quick question, because the title of your talk, actually the part of the title of your talk is China ready for global leadership? And the question might or might not be something that would otherwise come up in your talk. So it is this. You know from traveling around the world as a Post correspondent, I traveled around the world as a news correspondent as well, that sometimes undemocratic countries, and China in many ways still is, undemocratic countries cannot assume a position or even aspire to a position of global leadership. With China, would you say it's somehow different?
Well, the Chinese definitely have the ambition to do so. But so did the Soviets. And for a while, they did lead half the globe. So I think the Chinese definitely have the desire to attain that global leadership position. Question is whether they're going to be able to do it or not. And I'm going to try to spend the next 30 minutes telling people actually it's going to be very difficult, but we'll see.
Okay, well, go ahead and explain it.
Great. I'm going to stand up because it's more comfortable for me. I hope that's okay.
Sure.
I'm going to cover you in a shadow for a while. So it's wonderful to be here. I would really like to be skiing, but reality intervened. I spent the last 6 years of my life writing this book on the history of America's relations with China, and I started back in 1776. And in doing the research for the book, I kept on bumping into all these kind of cosmic serendipities between America's history and China's history and how we actually co-evolved together. And one of them is that the first fortunes in the United States were made in Boston and Salem, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, New York, and Philadelphia on the backs of the trade with China. So Americans brought huge loads of Mexican silver to China, in addition to otter pelts, seal pelts, sandalwood, sea cucumbers, to trade with the Chinese for tea, which they then brought back to the States and sold at a huge profit. They then took that money and invested that money in the United States, basically creating the initial foundations of what would be an economic boom in America and turning America by the end of the 19th century into the factory floor of the world. Flash forward a couple hundred years from then, and it's the wallet of the American consumer, investments from American companies in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s that actually financed China's economic boom and helped to turn China into the factory of the world. In the middle of the 19th century, America's in the midst of its massive civil war, the bloodiest war of all time in terms of a percentage of a population. At the same time, China, too, is in the midst of this incredible domestic conflagration called the Taiping Rebellion, which ended up with the death of some 30 million people. In the 1960s, we have millions of American students protesting at American universities against the Vietnam War and rallying for the right to drop out and turn on. At the same time, their Chinese counterparts in China, millions of them, are marching in the streets in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, fighting for what they called permanent revolution. We also even seem to be interested in some ways, in repeating each other's mistakes. So in the Ming Dynasty in China, the Chinese built a Great Wall. And it was built because of a debate within the Ming court between those who wanted to trade with the barbarians who lived in the north of China on the Asian steppe and those who wanted to fight them. And so they decided, we'll just build a wall and we'll compromise. Well, in the end, the wall failed, actually, miserably. Those barbarians invaded China in the middle of the 17th century, and they would end up ruling China up until 1911. So we have the Trump administration seized with this idea of building a wall on our southern border, again to fight back of what he believes is an invasion of migrants coming up from the south. My guess is that his wall will probably end up being as significant as the Great Wall in China, and will, in effect, in the end, be turned into a tourist landmark, much like its counterpart is in Beijing today. Another serendipity is that in the mid-'60s, both Richard Nixon and Chairman Mao, brilliant statesmen, both very flawed, but very brilliant statesmen, came upon the idea at about the same time that the United States and the Chinese needed to get together to end their Cold War, or at least put it on hold, and come together in a meeting and end the isolation. This serendipity, I think, was extraordinary. In thinking about these serendipities, I'm trying to sort of parse this question: is China ready to take up the reins of world leadership? I'm kind of faced with what I think is actually another eerie serendipity between the two countries, and that's that our current leaders, both in Washington and in Beijing, Donald Trump and China's President Xi Jinping, I think are fundamentally both countries on a roll to losing international credibility around the world. I believe that Donald Trump will not achieve his goal to make America great again, but similarly, I don't think Xi Jinping has what it takes to achieve what he calls the China dream. And I'm going to try to explain that. So yes, I am biased in this case, but I think objectively speaking, if you look at Trump's election, it was tailor-made for China, a China interested in taking over the mantle of global leadership. I mean, the president's first move in Asia was to remove the United States, to pull the United States out of the TransPacific Partnership, which is a treaty pact uniting 12 nations on the Pacific Rim, designed to push forward trade relations in a more modern way, both in terms of the manufactured goods, but also the trade in services. So Trump's move, yanking America out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, basically opened the field for the Chinese to dictate the terms of economic relationships, at least for a generation to come. Pulling the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership also removed a major incentive in China, China's possible accession to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for continued economic reforms in China itself. Then Trump doubled down and pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement, ceding another field, the environment, to China, even though China is the world's #1 polluter. Trump's ignorance of economics has also, I think, hamstrung what, from my perspective, is a welcome hardening of U.S. policy towards China. His belief, his conflation of the American trade deficit with China, which I fundamentally don't think matters that much, with China's attempts to steal or otherwise acquire U.S. technology, which I think matters significantly, has significantly hurt the relations with China. And so instead of surgically punishing Chinese companies which have stolen U.S. technology, Trump instead slapped tariffs on a broad array of products coming into the United States, penalizing American consumers and American companies much more than Chinese miscreants. And then there's Trump's kind of questioning of U.S. alliances. I mean, the United States alliance system has helped make America into a superpower. His madcap pronouncements that Japan and South Korea could go nuclear, and his recent fight with South Korea, threatening to pull American forces out of South Korea if South Korea doesn't pony up more scratch to pay for the American soldiers defending it. All of these moves erode and are eroding the faith that America's allies have in the United States. So on a broad front, from my perspective, from security to trade to international public opinion to the environment, China was really well positioned to benefit from the chaos that Trump is sowing in Asia. Except it's not. And I think thanks to another peculiar coincidence in our history, China's Xi Jinping is seemingly intent on kind of channeling his inner Trump. He's totally failed to capitalize on what one Chinese newspaper actually called Trump's election a once-in-a-thousand-years opportunity for China. Soon after Trump was elected, China very much looked like it wanted to take over the mantle of global leadership. In Davos in January of 2017, Xi Jinping went there and gave a speech basically framing China as the last defender of globalization. Chinese press began to churn out this statement called the China Solution, which was its belief that, this is state-run press, that China's kind of mix of mercantilist economic policy and authoritarian political policies was a new model for developing nations the world over. But as time has passed, this model doesn't look that attractive. I mean, you've probably read what's going on in Xinjiang province in the northwest of China. Xi's people have incarcerated upwards of 1 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Tajiks, and Kyrgyz in a move that he claims is against terrorism. We have like the recreation of a Soviet-style gulag in northwestern China. They make Trump's moves against asylum seekers look almost hospitable. This is 70 years. This year is 70 years since the founding of the People's Republic of China, and China really has not at all begun to deal with its minority problems. The fact that it's now creating an emerging Palestine in its northwest territories, I think significantly militates against any potential for being a great global superpower in the years to come. And this is not even mentioning what's going to happen in Tibet once the Dalai Lama dies. Right? That's a whole other ball of wax, and it could be very bloody as well. Internally in China, Xi took power in 2012, promising significant economic reforms. But they haven't happened. And instead, his policies have bolstered China's state-owned sector to the detriment of China's private sector, which is really the engine of development in China. So China's growth rate now is compared to ours, enormous. It's wonderful. It's more than 6%. But it's actually the lowest growth rate in China in 28 years. And a lot of factors are pointing to a continued difficulty that the Chinese are going to have in keeping that growth rate high. On foreign policy, instead of reaching out to America's worried allies, what Xi has done is he's doubled down. He sort of ratcheted up the pressure on his neighbors around in Asia. He's continued, and he's also continued to militarize the South China Sea. So now we see China's relations with Vietnam continue to be strained. The same goes for its relations with Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore. He launched an economic embargo on South Korea after the South Koreans deployed an American theater missile radar defense system to try to protect themselves against North Korean missiles. It would seem to be understandable, but he cracked down on the South. And his relations with Japan and India continue to be testy. And in the West, look at how he's treated Canada recently. I mean, Canada, other than being the friendliest country in the world, has always been a bulwark in the West against any push to make relations with China difficult. It's really the bulwark in the West standing up for a strong relationship with China. And in fact, its Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has staked his foreign policy reputation on the ability to maintain good ties with Beijing. But then Canada arrested, following a US extradition request, an executive from the Huawei telecommunications company in December. And instead of going softly with the Canadians and using kind of divide and conquer tactics, the Chinese cracked down. They turned around, they arrested 2 Canadians in China on vague national security concerns, and then they did something extraordinary. They had recently sentenced, the Chinese court had recently sentenced the Canadian to a 15-year jail term for his involvement in a methamphetamine ring. And in December they said, oops, I think we think we made a mistake on this sentence, which they actually took them 32 months to decide on. And in a 1-hour court hearing, they sentenced that Canadian to death. And then, to kind of top it off, China's ambassador to Canada wrote an op-ed in a Canadian newspaper basically calling these legal maneuvers self-defense, which is basically acknowledging that these were done totally in retaliation for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive, in Vancouver last month. Now, China's over-the-top reaction to the Huawei arrest clearly indicates that China's worried about what she might tell American investigators should she be extradited to the United States. And the Huawei case also illustrates a further example of Xi Jinping's overreach. because the Chinese made this assumption that Huawei, which has links to the People's Liberation Army and is a significant security concern to any nation that wants, for accepting China to run effectively its telecommunications system. But the Chinese assumed that Huawei would be able to build out this telecommunications network across the globe without any pushback. But now the pushback has begun, not just in the United States, which basically doesn't let Huawei do any business here, but it's also started in Canada, the UK, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. But more broadly on international trade, when Trump pulled the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, many analysts in the United States predicted that China was going to jump into the breach and basically, as I said earlier, dictate the terms of economic relationships going forward for the next generation. But instead, the Chinese offered these sort of reheated, what they called regional comprehensive economic partnerships, which aren't comprehensive, don't have anything to do with free trade, and actually don't completely exclude services to its neighbors around Asia. Understandably, the neighbors rejected it, and quite interestingly, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, didn't die. And in fact, TPP 11 exists, and it just went into, it took effect on December 30th. So from my perspective, this is a huge defeat for China, which was poised to be able to step into a place that the United States had vacated to occupy that vacuum. It's a huge lost opportunity for Xi Jinping. Now, closer to home, I think Xi Jinping is mismanaging relations with Hong Kong. The Chinese have pulled back from a promise to allow the Hong Kong people to directly elect the chief executive. And then when it comes to Taiwan, instead of offering the Taiwanese people an olive branch on a speech on January 1st, Xi Jinping doubled down and threatened to invade them and said that any talks between a Hong Kong politician and a Chinese politician must be done against the background of unification as a goal, despite the fact that the vast majority of people in Hong Kong don't want to be unified with China. So kind of like Trump's ham-handed dealings with the Democratic Party, Xi Jinping here isn't really practicing divide and conquer techniques. He's not taking a page from Sun Tzu's Art of War. He's just trying to conquer. Final, in terms of political overreach, Xi Jinping really took the cake last year when he declared himself president for life. I think this is an extraordinary dismantling of the architecture of political stability in China, and it sets China on a road to serious political problems once Xi Jinping begins to age. Now, since '49 in China, since the communist takeover in China, the political transition from one party leader to another has always been a source of major instability. That was one of the backgrounds to the Tiananmen Square crisis of 1989. And Deng Xiaoping, China's main reformer, he's the great reformer, understood this. So Deng Xiaoping created this whole structure of political transition with term limits and aging people out at after a certain age. But Xi did away with these rules, creating, really, I think, an almost inevitable political fight once he begins to grow old. He's 64, 65 this year. Now, in terms of relations with the developing world, which really should be China's strength, China is also putting itself in great difficulty. Xi's signature foreign policy initiative is called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this massive infrastructure project across the globe. It's sort of, imagine a wheel with spokes of ports and airports and rail and power stations spanning the globe, radiating across the globe with China at its center. But as Chinese companies push deeper into emerging markets, yes, they are building great, vast infrastructure projects, but they're also getting involved directly in the internal politics of those countries. So you look at what happened in Malaysia recently. Chinese firms overcharged Malaysia on a vast array of infrastructure projects. They then took that money and gave it to Malaysian officials who funneled it in to Malaysia's development program called 1MBD. They also took a portion of that money as well and funneled it into the re-election campaign of Premier Najib Razak. The only problem was that Najib lost his re-election campaign, and the fellow who came in to replace him, Mohammed Mahathir, immediately started out by canceling a series of very big-ticket Chinese projects, and ironically, Mahathir has become now the global spokesman against China's treatment of the Uyghurs in northwestern China. China did the same, pulled the same shenanigans in Sri Lanka as well, and it's also done it in the South Pacific. In the end, this type of behavior is not going to help China as it seeks to sort of dominate the globe, if you will. In both Malaysia and Sri Lanka, candidates who were reelected ran on an anti-Chinese program and used sleazy Chinese deals as campaign issues. So instead of looking out across the world from inside the confines of Zhongnanhai, the Communist Party headquarters, and seeing a world that is clamoring for Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping is actually seeing a world that is as nervous about China as it is about the United States. Inside China's two other major factors that I'll address and then I'll stop also militate against China's rise. One is environmental issues, and the second is demographics. The environmental issues, China definitely should be praised for the amount of work it's doing in trying to clean up its environment. It should be praised for its investments in clean technology, electric cars, renewable energy. It wants to dominate these fields because it believes they're some of the industries of the future. But at the same time, it's also trying to deal with what has been decades of environmentally disastrous policymaking as it sought to grow its economy at all costs. But cleaning up the environment in China is proving to be extremely difficult. So we just moved back from China in 2016. We called ourselves pollution refugees. We moved back to Berkeley. Previously, we moved to LA, and even the air was better in LA, but that's beside the point. But in 2016 and 2017, the air actually improved in northern China significantly. In 2018, not so much. In fact, it got a lot worse, partially because of some of the trade-offs that the Xi Jinping government had to make between keeping factories open, if you didn't want to close the factories because you were worried about social stability, and improving the environment. And in 2018, they made the hard decision to keep the factories open, so the air in Beijing is now as bad as it was in 2016. That shows how difficult cleaning up the environment is going to be. Finally, demographics. Demographics in China are unrelenting and unrelentingly bad. China is aging really, really quickly. You've probably heard this before. Its workforce began shrinking in 2015, and countries with shrinking workforces, unless they really jack up their productivity, do not grow as fast as countries with stable or growing workforces. Now, the reason China's workforce is shrinking, of course, is because of the one-child policy. Right? The one-child policy since the early 80s effectively cut 300 million people off China's population rolls. That is very good for the globe. It's very bad for China, though. So China has taken steps to try to encourage Chinese families to have more children. It started in 2015. It got rid of the one-child policy. But that policy is failing. Last week, Chinese official statistics said that in 2017, China had the smallest birth population since 1961, which was in the middle of one of the greatest famines China's ever faced. 17.23 million people. They expected more than 20 million people. They got significantly less. This year, the median age in China will be over 38. It will surpass that of the United States, and we're a rich country still. It will surpass that of the United States, and it will be 10 years older than that of India. China's workforce shortage is also a shortage of not just of workers, of course, but also a shortage of consumers. Secondly, on the other side of the aging problem is the rapid growth of China's elderly population. In a couple of years, the percentage of people over the age of 60 in China will be higher than that of the United States. It's going to have 100 million people over the age of 80. And already, pension funds throughout the country are announcing shortfalls. And so this social safety net, which China has just begun to work to build, is already fraying, not less than 20 years before it was built. Now, these are first world problems, pension issues, and issues with an aging population. But China is not yet a first world country. So from my perspective, China now actually possesses two ingredients that could lead to an economic stagnation of the type that has stymied Japan's development over the last 2 decades. One, aging, a rapidly aging population, and second, an unwillingness and an inability to reform. Now, on the plus side, China is trying to become the economy of the 21st century. China does want to be a global leader. China is rapidly improving and reforming its military. As Greg noted, China just got to the far side of the moon several weeks ago. It's investing massively in artificial intelligence, biopharma, automation, robotics, because it understands that increasing productivity in the face of a shrinking workforce is the only way out of this trap for itself. I think all of these endeavors have promise. I've lived in China. I've seen this movie of this country that when I went there in 1980 was a fifth world country, and today in many places is, in terms of infrastructure, is more advanced than that of my own country. But I also think that without sage leaders who can construct alliances with other countries that China can use to leverage its nascent power, and also without a leadership that can harness the entrepreneurial zeal, but also the real creativity of the Chinese people, I think it's going to be very difficult for China to take over the mantle of America anytime soon. And so what worries me in concluding is not the prospect of China's rise, it's how the United States is going to be able to manage the potential for China's slide. And I think in a situation in which both countries, the leaders of both countries are not up to the job, and secondly, the managers of the relationship, the most important relationship of any two countries in the world are also not up to the job, that gives you great cause for concern. So, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Sure.
John, first of all, would you prefer for questions and answers to stand on your 1.5 working knees?
I'm going to kind of squat like this.
Okay. To begin with, you referred a few times to China's aspiration to take over the mantle of global leadership. Historically, unless I'm mistaken, China has always aspired at most to regional leadership. So what drove this expansion of their aspirations?
Well, I think they've always been opportunistic about it, and I think they saw an opportunity, specifically with the election of Trump, but also starting in 2008 with the the American-led global financial crisis, that they could really not easily take over the mantle of leadership, but there was an opportunity for them to do so.
But still, what drove it in the minds of leadership that had been born and raised themselves into a nation that never thought about that? A fifth world nation, as you put it.
Well, I also think that, again, now China's interests are global. They're a huge oil importing nation. A significant part of their economy is reliant on their exports around the world, so they want to dominate export markets and be able to control those markets. They need, because of their economic overproduction in many cases, to export that overproduction elsewhere, specifically to places like Africa. And so their interests are now global. And so they no longer can confine themselves to simply being a regional power. They must go global for them to continue, they believe, to grow and to prosper.
And we've been all of us reading about that, spreading their money and spreading their influence around the world, particularly Africa, but other third world parts of this planet for 20 years anyway. With their economy reportedly slowing down itself, is that slowing down this move to establish roots on other parts of the planet?
Well, I think it's interesting, in the last few months, you see the Chinese press at least emphasize less the benefits of the Belt and Road Initiative. And there is, China's not a free country, and so it doesn't have a free press, but there is now increasingly in social media circles in China, even though they're censored often as soon as they're posted, significant pushback against the Belt and Road Initiative by Chinese people saying, why don't you invest this money in our own country? There's a populism there as well, questioning this outbound of investment, saying, hey, you should put it into Ningxia or some of our poorer provinces here.
When you talk about investing in their own country, you referred to the Northwest Territories, where there's a very restive population for a variety of reasons. Some are cultural, some are economic and otherwise. But from what I've read, there are 300 to 350 million people in that part of China who are restive. That's equivalent to the entire population of the United States of America. So basically, a quarter of the Chinese population have not been the beneficiaries of those go-go years. How do they deal with that?
I think the numbers are a lot lower than that.
Are they?
In terms of actual Uyghur and Kazakh and Tajik numbers, it's about 6 million.
Really?
Yeah, the population of Xinjiang is pretty small. Xinjiang is a vast region, but compared to other parts of China, it has a very small population. I mean, and when it comes to Tibet, there are only 3.6 million Tibetans. So it's a relatively small population, but it's a vast region, and it occupies 60%. Tibet and Ningxia, Tibet, Qinghai, and Xinjiang together occupy about 60% of China's landmass. So it's a significant problem from that perspective as well.
So
but it's not the population of America.
Do you see
That would be a real mess.
Well, it would be a real mess. Do you see the Chinese government trying to deal with that, though, by giving them a little more liberty and giving them a little more prosperity, or by putting them down?
So the Chinese government says that it tried the liberty route, it tried the economic prosperity route, and none of that failed. And so what they're trying to do is basically throw these people into thought reform through labor camps in order to inspire them to love China more. Basically you're seeing the recreation of sort of Stalin's gulag out there now. It's quite extraordinary, and no one really expected this would happen. But again, this is what happened when it happens, I believe, when you don't have a leader with real vision at the center of your country.
When did you first start reporting from China?
My first reporting job was in 1988 when I was sent there by the Associated Press.
So when you first started reporting from there, could you already see signs that China was going to move in the direction it has moved?
That was when you first saw private businesses in Beijing. And the people who made the first, actually, fortunes in China were the cab drivers and the restaurant owners. And many of them were actually, they'd suffered and they'd been in labor camps and they'd been released, and because they didn't belong to any Chinese work unit, they had no way to make money, and so the government basically said, well, you were in jail for 20 years, go open a restaurant. And actually they made the first large amounts of money. So you could see that the entrepreneurial zeal of the Chinese had been oppressed for many decades, and it was just sprouting out all over the place. I could never imagine that China would have been turned into the country that it is today, but you could definitely see the hunger and the materialistic drive of people to make their lives better.
Are there parallels anywhere else in the world? I don't think so.
They have taken, if you just look at a parallel with America, they have taken about 150 years of our history and compressed it into about 40 years. And I think that's pretty extraordinary.
And those restaurants, by the way, they're probably pretty good restaurants because you see a lot of Chinese people eating there. That's, they say that's how
there
you know
you
it's a
go,
good Chinese
exactly.
restaurant. With respect to democracy in China, and I use the word loosely because we all define it a little differently, particularly in different parts of the world. There is internet there, although not completely open. There is democracy on a democratic level, to which you referred, although it doesn't have quite the freedoms of American democracy. I mean, would you predict that they can keep the limits where they are in this world where everything is so open, where Chinese people are allowed to travel and all the rest?
I'm sort of a cautious optimism about, not that China's going to start electing its president anytime soon, but I think that the current direction of the government right now, they're instituting probably the most severe crackdown on independent thought that we've seen in China since the tanks were called out in 1989.
And you were there for that.
I was there for that. And I don't see that as sustainable in a country which needs to be a 21st century economy with the free flow of information, et cetera. They've done remarkably well for a significant period of time so far in a repressive environment, but still nonetheless growing their economy. But I think at the end of the day, and that day could be very long because Americans are impatient and China works on its own time, that there will be a freer China in the future. How it's going to form itself, pull itself together is anyone's question. But I also think that the actions of China's president, Xi Jinping, in creating the potential for a real factional struggle within the Communist Party, and he's done so unwittingly, I would argue, pushes that day closer. because once he becomes frail, the factions will struggle, and that could very well manifest itself out on the street, much like it did in 1989.
So it sounds like if Tiananmen Square were to happen again today, if the same level of protests were to take place, are you saying you believe that ultimately he would resort to the same tactics as his predecessor
Well, I think
30 years ago?
he would try to, quote unquote, nip it in the bud. The question is, if something like that, and this is all
hypothetical.
guesswork, but if something like that would happen again, he would try to nip it in the bud much faster. Because the criticism that the party gave itself around Tiananmen Square was they didn't move quickly enough. They didn't kill fast and quick. And they let it metastasize until there were 10 million people on the streets of Beijing and in many other cities around China.
Questions from the audience? It's kind of bright here, but Chris, you've got the microphone, and he's going to take it to you. And will you explain how to use the microphone, by the way?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do.
Any of you, hold it
Yeah.
this way, not
Yeah.
this way, but straight out from your mouth. We hear you better.
Could you comment on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the U.S. has signed and China's not included in, please?
Yeah, so this was a trade deal that was negotiated by the Obama administration that then it actually was really shepherded through by Hillary Clinton in many ways. But then when she ran for president, she was against it after she was for it. And Trump's really one of his first actions was to pull the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Then everyone expected that once the United States pulled out, it was going to collapse because we were the biggest economy involved. You know, there were 11 other countries, but no one was as big as we were. But something really interesting happened. That Japan and Australia, specifically Japan, showed real international leadership, and they resuscitated it. And it's gone into force on December 30th. And those 11 countries are now in a large trade bloc. And when the treaty was being negotiated, China was not excluded. There was always the door open for China to accede to the treaty if it could accept and go by the terms of the treaty. And that's still, it's still open for China to accede to those terms. But the interesting thing is both we're out and the Chinese are out. And going forward, it's going to be very difficult, for example, for American cattlemen to sell their meat into Japan because other countries who are in the TPP are going to get significantly lower tariffs, like the Australians and the Kiwis, than we have. And so in the end, we've kind of, Trump, by calling it a bad deal and pulling the United States out, has really kicked an own goal, and we have to figure out a way to get back in, ultimately. And I think we ultimately wound up doing so.
But sits.
No, Trump, on his first day in office, pulled the United States out.
It was actually the first official decision he announced.
Right.
With respect to that trade pact, what was it about it that China didn't like?
Well, the
It's
Chinese,
in its own area.
The Chinese didn't like the fact that there were restrictions on state-owned enterprises doing business. There was very strict intellectual property right protections. There were enforcement mechanisms. And there was also a trade in services, which the Chinese have been reluctant to get involved in. They didn't like some of the a lot of the other countries didn't like some of the pharmaceutical provisions, but the Chinese hated those as well because they rip off drugs production as well. And so the Chinese didn't like that, and they pulled out too. I mean, they didn't pull out, but they haven't. But interestingly enough, when TPP was announced in November of 2014, the Chinese were the Chinese reformers were very happy about it because China's always used international agreements as a way to force reform, pro-market reform in China. And once the United States pulled out of it, it really weakened the course of potential economic reform in China.
Mm-hmm. Over there.
Yeah, I'm talking with some of my Chinese friends and business colleagues. They've talked times about a grand bargain having been made where the general population has had incredible increases in their standards of living, and sort of, maybe some of their day-to-day freedoms, going to movies or their entertainment, but that the Communist Party had said, but we're going to control the state, the government, the politics. And I guess my question is, first, do you see truth to that characterization? And then secondly, what happens or what will happen if they are indeed facing slowing economic growth, debt problems, and the economy doesn't do so well for them in the future?
Right. So when I first went to China in 1980, and I lived in a 10 by 15 foot room with 7 guys for about a year. And it was, talk about cultural immersion. My bed was 5'10", I was 6'3". And my classmates, when they graduated, were all assigned jobs. They didn't have any choice in their jobs. And when they wanted to get married, they had to get the approval of their boss. If they wanted to leave and get a better job, they had to get the approval of their old boss. If they wanted to travel, they had to spend months applying to travel to leave the country. That whole system is gone. In terms of personal freedom of Chinese, it's expanded extraordinarily. They can leave whenever they want to. They can switch jobs. They can go abroad. Now they can have 2 kids instead of 1. It's doubling at least, but many of them don't because it's so damn expensive. So personal freedom is expanded extraordinarily. So back to your point, yeah, there was and there is a tacit social compact, if you will, saying that if you don't mess with politics, we'll let you make a lot of money. The problem, though, is, to your point, that if the economy begins to slow, that single coin of legitimacy, which is the GDP growth, begins to become devalued in the face of many Chinese. They're like, hey, I want to have a better life than my parents. Where's that possibility? And also over time, you do see China's younger generation beginning to say, personal freedom is no longer enough. I want more than that. Now, they're not angling to vote for the mayor yet, and I think that's going to take some time. But they are angling for a free flow of information. They are angling for information about the latest technology. And that directly also impacts the potential for their economy to continue to grow in the future. So I think that's a really good question, and I think ultimately, as the economy slows, which inevitably it's going to, there will be a real push for some type of political change in the country. It's not going to be on anybody's timeline in this room, but I think ultimately it's going to happen. The reaction of the party, so if you look at how Xi Jinping has rolled, his sole goal is to keep the party in power, right? And if you look at actually China's defense expenditures, China's defense expenditures are actually lower than the amount of money it gives to the Chinese police and security services to maintain internal stability. I mean, that's extraordinary, but it's true. That's where they put their money, is in maintaining internal stability. So I don't think the party is going to be very happy about any calls for a different type of polity in the country. And the party is going to fight it tooth and nail.
Speaking of, go ahead.
But as Xi Jinping ages, factions are going to pop up. They're going to attempt to manipulate public opinion, and one faction might go to the public and say, we have a different vision for our country, and this is what it is. And all bets are off, partially because Xi Jinping himself has dismantled this actually relatively sturdy architecture of political transition that Deng Xiaoping erected in the 1970s and 80s.
You referred to defense expenditures. China's feeling its oats. They're challenging our longtime dominance in the South China Sea.
Yes.
It's their neighborhood, and they now believe that they ought to be in charge of their neighborhood. They are expanding upon a military that used to be almost exclusively a land army, and a large one, to establish a significant and growing navy. Talk a little about that.
So,
and what's it mean to us?
So China clearly wants the United States first out of what they call the first island chain territory. So if you look at Asia and you look at Japan going down to Taiwan, the Philippines, and down to the sort of the boot of Vietnam, that inside that area is what the Chinese refer to as the first island chain. And they want to dominate that space. It includes the Sea of Japan, it includes seas near Korea, it includes seas near the Philippines. That's one of the reasons why they want to push out and dominate the South China Sea. They look at it as their, as you said, their backyard. After that, though, the Chinese, because they're opportunistic, if they see weakness in the United States, they want to push the United States out of the Western Pacific, all told. Back to, as one Chinese naval officer told me, said, back to Hawaii. And so Their military modernization is focused right now on anti-access denial. They want to deny the Navy the ability to operate near China's shores. So anti-aircraft missiles, they've been developing one for decades. It looks like it's going to work. They're very aggressive in their submarine development, and their naval development is much more rapid than their army development. In fact, they're cutting their army to the smallest it's been in decades, and they're putting the bulk of their resources in their navy, their rocket forces, and their air force. And these are all a way to project Chinese firepower outside of Chinese borders into the blue waters of the Pacific Ocean.
So I was just curious, when we talk about world leadership, in your head and in your intellect, what factors, metrics do you put in your human computer to define what country is a world leader? You know, GNP, size of military, number of atomic bombs, whatever.
So I would stress, I mean, GDP, the economic size is important, clearly. But you don't have to be the biggest, and China will soon surpass the United States as the greatest GDP. But I look at the ability to cobble together international coalitions to get things done in the world community. I look at soft power as being very important. The ability to influence other people with your ideas, I think that's enormously important, especially in this day and age. And the ability to maintain an international system that we, the United States, cobbled together because we understood very clearly that the previous system of every man or woman for him or herself was not a system that worked. And I think the ability of the United States to pull that together was signified that we were a global leader. And that's one of the reasons why I don't think China has the ability to do so, to take our place. The question is whether we're going to cede it to disarray, not to China. I don't think China's right behind us. I think the alternative, and the scarier alternative, is a return to every man for himself. And so that's what I look at in terms of global leadership, the ability to convince other countries to do things that's in their interest, but it's also in your interest. And I don't think China's there either. China has no allies other than Pakistan and Sudan, and maybe Zimbabwe.
I would add one more factor, if you will, and this comes from my experience in the Middle East, where I spent the plurality of my time, and that is being the go-to nation, the nation to which others go, not just to form a coalition, but sometimes unilaterally, to get adversaries together and try to create either a peace or a pact of some kind. Who's next with the microphone? Over here.
Do you think that China has stolen enough intellectual property to meet their objectives in at least the near future with what they've already done?
That's a great question. They definitely have stolen a huge amount, but I think they still want to steal a lot more. And the fact that they're so over the top in their reaction to the Huawei arrest in Canada, to me, indicates that she's got a great story to tell, and they're worried that she might tell it if she comes to America. And that's just one aspect of the technological theft which has gone on. I mean, you know, Huawei's operating systems were based on stolen Cisco programs. In fact, they stole so much, they even stole some of the jokes that the Cisco programmers wrote into the code.
Really?
They didn't get them.
Could you also talk about the competition in artificial intelligence between the U.S. and China?
Yeah, so that's a great issue. And there is a lot of very productive joint research that can go on between both countries. And there's a lot of cross-investment in Silicon Valley into China and China into Silicon Valley on these issues. The problem is that there increasingly has a military or security aspect to AI as well. And so the issue is how to be able to maintain productive scientific cooperation on industrial issues as you bump up against national security concerns. And so that's, it's an area where there's huge competition between the two countries, but also, like many areas, it's also an area where there's a lot of cooperation between the two countries. And the issue is how to square that circle, how to make it work, but work for both us and China, not just for China. And the problem is the pattern in the past is these types of relationships have generally ended up working really well for China and not so well for us. So the issue is how to try to change that. And there's probably a way to do it subtly, but right now I know the FBI is trying to do it with a hammer. And that's difficult because it's difficult to hit a fly with a hammer. But those are some of the challenges. And it's not just in AI, it's also in advanced medical technology, it's also in communications technology, it's also in chip technology as well. And battery technology. There's ways to cooperate with the Chinese, but the issue is how to avoid the Chinese simply ripping off the technology, taking it home, and back to your point, getting where they want to go without us.
John, you just said there's some cooperation between the two countries. What form does that take? Is it government to government, university to university?
No, it's joint investment. It's Zhongguancun in Beijing, which is China's version of Silicon Valley. It's the investment from Shenzhen. It's Chinese engineers educated in America, working in China, or coming back to the United States. Silicon Valley has a very strong Chinese ecosystem in addition to being a strong American and Indian ecosystem. There's a lot of back and forth cross investment. A lot of these type of deals, but in the recent year or so, many of those deals have been stopped, partially because of national security concerns. So this is a complicated issue, and there's the potential for cooperation is great, but the potential for loss of American leadership is great as well.
Yeah. My question is related because the U.S. universities rely on Chinese students to come to the U.S. because they pay full tuition. And that allows us to give scholarships to American students or other diverse students who can't afford full tuition. Do you see that changing with this concern over them, particularly in the engineering fields, stealing our technology and our education and forming these relationships? Do you see that changing and putting limitations on foreign students coming to the U.S.?
So that's a great question. I mean, an example I think would be the University of Minnesota, where 10% of the student body is from China, and they pay full freight. And that means Minnesotans get to go to school, not just with scholarships, but also with lower fees. And so that's a way that, I mean, it's a multi tens of billions of dollar industry. And it's not just actually in universities, it's now also in high schools. There's been a lot of media attention to this issue because of cases involving Chinese stealing technologies out of labs in universities. But I also think there's a possibility, one would hope, that as the United States seeks to deal with this problem, it doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. And there are ways to, for example, look at the research being done, and if the research is involving a piece of equipment that cannot be exported from the United States without a specific customs approval, to treat the people who deal with that product to make sure that they're given clearance to actually touch the product. It's called a deemed export. And this is very bureaucratic stuff, but it's also very important to get it right. Because if you alienate the Chinese, it's not simply the fact that they're paying a lot of money and they're helping to subsidize American students. It's also, it's an incredibly important cultural bridge between the two countries. It has been since the 1850s, when the first batch of Chinese boys came to Hartford, Connecticut to learn how to, actually, the Chinese wanted them to learn military technology, but didn't work out that way. But nonetheless, it's a hugely important part of our people-to-people relationship, and damaging that, I think, would do great harm to the relationship writ large. So there's a way to deal with a problem. The problem is definitely there, but just basically saying ban Chinese students, I just don't think that's the solution to the problem.
And that cultural bridge, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a two-way bridge, because American universities, probably around the time you were in China, began teaching Chinese universities how to be more like American universities. I think Yale took the lead in it, giving them a taste of American-style education so that their students wouldn't have to come over here.
Yeah, well, this is a continuation of the missionary tradition, where basically Christian missionaries in China built China's higher education system. All the great universities in China today were actually universities that were built by mostly American money, some Brit money, but mostly American money. Tsinghua University being a perfect example.
Yeah. One of the issues that we've seen on college campuses, though, is that when the Chinese students come, they don't socialize with any other students, and they have their own clubs, their own dinners, and so that culture exchange doesn't happen. So how do you really get that on a college campus and get them to start to, do that exchange and really spend time with their other students?
That's a great point, especially when you have so many. And I think for example, when the Chinese first came to the United States in the 1980s as students, they were in the minority, so they had to get to know the United States. Now, as you speak, they can come, they can spend all day on WeChat, and in fact, they can get their homework done on WeChat. They could spend weeks without actually speaking any English. I mean, I've seen it at Cal as well, amongst the Chinese community there. I think that's a huge issue. I think that's an issue that's also a responsibility of the universities to begin to try to figure out ways to, not to force them to be friends with other people, but to realize that they're not involved simply in education, they're also involved in acculturation. And it's not going to happen by itself. There has to be more effort in bringing the Chinese in and to break down the walls between the Chinese community and the rest of the student body there as well. And that's a huge challenge. It's not easy, but it's not just like on the Chinese to become more interested in America. I think it's part and parcel of how to deal with this issue, because it's been going on for quite some time, and I think it's time that we kind of take a look at that as well.
With regard to China's goal of controlling the seas in its area, how do the other Asian countries feel about this? And assuming that if they don't like it, what is their leverage to do something about it, and how might India play a role in that?
How might
India play a role?
So I'll answer India first. The Indians, so recently you probably noticed the change in the American verbiage about the Pacific region. The United States has started calling the Pacific region the Indo-Pacific. And if that's not trying to rope India into the Pacific Ocean, I don't know what is. But the Indians are eager to be roped into the Pacific Ocean. They look at that as part of their neighborhood as well. So much so that when the Russians sold the Vietnamese Kilo-class submarines, the Indians were actually the ones training the Vietnamese how to use the Kilo-class submarines. Other nations are cheerleading the United States, often very quietly, to push back against the Chinese militarization of the South China Sea. But the Japanese will actually begin freedom of navigation exercises with the Americans. The British have done some. The French have even done some. The Australians are a little bit more timid, but they'll probably start doing some. So there is significant support from America's friends and allies in Asia for the United States to push back, but not push back so far that we're going to get into a shooting war with the Chinese. The Trump administration, to its credit, has been more forthright in pushing back against the Chinese in the South China Sea than the Obama administration was previously. And there's a significant support. But again, the support is tempered by concerns about the unpredictability of this administration in terms of what's it going to do. Because it'll push freedom of navigation operations for a while, and then suddenly throw them up as a potential bargaining chip for, buying more American soybeans. I mean, you never know, because everything's up for transaction. And so that's the concern that Asian friends have on this issue as well.
Hold it this way.
Given the realities that you explained very, very well about the diplomatic leadership in both China and the United States right now, as well as the economic imperatives, as well as the commercial and intellectual opportunities, what do you see as the best case scenario for the near term?
In U.S.-China relations? Much more competition. A degeneration. I mean, Cold War. Cold War summons up feelings of sort of scenes of hiding under your desk and spy versus spy. Although spy versus spy is happening very intensely. In fact, the CIA lost significant amount of assets in China recently. Several people were executed as well. But I think the competition is going to be stressed far more than cooperation between the two countries. And I think we're degenerating into an ideological battle. It's not simply competition between two great powers, but I think at root there's an evolving ideological issue between the two countries that I think could not poison the atmosphere between the countries for a significant period of the future, but it's really going to influence things for quite some time. I mean, it's not simply two big countries competing, but there is real ideational ideas. There's a challenge of ideas that is developing between the two sides that in some ways are similar to the Soviet Union, except the Chinese have more to argue on their side because they can say, hey, look at our economy. So the reason why you beat the Soviets was because your economy was better. Your ideas were better, but your economy was actually better. But now our economy is very strong. And so the Chinese believe they have more of a model to push out as opposed to the Western liberal model at a period of time when the Western liberal model is under assault in the West as well, both in this country and then also in Europe as well.
Over here.
Could you comment on the Taiwan-China issues and where you see America's role in the defense of Taiwan?
Yeah. So I think the Taiwan story of its political democratization really is an extraordinary story. This is really one of the most democratic. The press is the freest in Asia. It's a little bit wild, actually. It's so free, but and as a place with a growing identity as really an island of democracy in Asia, I think it's really quite an extraordinary story. And so my belief is that the United States should support Taiwan to the fullest extent that it can. China's position, of course, is that Taiwan is a province of China. The United States should not be involved in anything to do with Taiwan, and anything that the United States does with Taiwan is interference in the internal affairs of China. And the Chinese have not yet given the Taiwanese a timeline as to when Taiwan should return to the fold, but the Chinese have recently, in a recent series of speeches, been stressing the fact that China will not wait forever. And this January 1 speech by Xi Jinping to Taiwan was significant in that it really laid down some markers and once again raised the specter of a military invasion. I personally don't think that invasion is going to come anytime soon, partially because I think that Xi Jinping does not want to take the risk, because if they lose, the party will probably fall in China. China can't lose a war like it lost to the Vietnamese in the 1970s and 80s. It cannot do that again, especially with Taiwan. And so my sense is that the issue for Taiwan is, the key issue is, one, its national defense, how to make itself as strong as possible so it looks really, I mean, some people call it the porcupine theory. A bear can eat a porcupine anytime it wants to, but it doesn't want to. So it can look like a porcupine. And secondly, Taiwan really has to deal with its economic issues. A significant number of Taiwanese don't like China, but they're willing to go to China because there are good jobs in China. Taiwan needs to work as best as possible in bringing home some of its investment, being less dependent on China for its economic development and its economic future. And that's going to be very difficult for Taiwan to do, because China's growth rate is 6.5, 6.6%, and Taiwan's is 2.3 to, if that. And so that's, I think, their two biggest challenges: defending itself and then also making a future for people living in Taiwan. And the United States can play a role in both. So that's
You said the leadership, amongst other things, probably wouldn't invade Taiwan because they're afraid they could lose.
They could lose.
It's hard to imagine. China has more than 1.2 or 1.3 billion people, much bigger army. Could they conceivably lose to Taiwan?
So if you look at the situation, there are basically very small, very few beaches on the west coast of Taiwan that you could land on. And the Taiwanese can concentrate a lot of firepower on those beaches. The Taiwan Strait is 100 kilometers wide. That's not narrow. It's pretty big. It's 60 miles. And it has some of the worst weather in the world. There's only a couple of months out of the year where you actually can launch an invasion. The Chinese are still working slowly on getting their amphibious landing technology together, and that's a big challenge. And then working with coordinating the Air Force with the Marines and the Navy is a very big challenge as well. And the Taiwanese do have a decent Air Force. They do have very good land-to-air missiles. They do have good anti-aircraft. And so the potential for Taiwan to make itself just into that porcupine is still, I think, quite high. The issue is will, money, but also their economy.
So we're going to wrap it up here, and Greg, I'll let you give us just a little what to expect in the second half. So we'll start back again at 7:30 once Greg closes this out. John, thank you so much, and wonderful questions from everybody. So, and I'm going to ask John and also Jamie Metzel, who's speaking tomorrow, sitting in the back row and has been here a number of times. I'm going to ask them both to go to the table in the back. So if you'd like to talk to them during the intermission, they've also got their books back there. But let them get back there before you stop to ask them a question. Otherwise, we kind of get a log jam. So, Greg.
And both of tomorrow night's speakers, Johanna Gao and Jamie Metzel, are here tonight. And so if you can hook up with them, if you want to, please feel free. Brad Setzer is going to talk after the intermission about the trade war or the tariff war. I mean, if there's anything that people with IRAs ought to be concerned about right now, it's the tariff war. And so you're going to hear from him because he's an economics expert on a global level. I'm going to close out with one quick observation. When I was a kid, was that applause or get out of here? I don't, when I was a kid, I remember thinking, we don't recognize China? What does that mean? We had no diplomatic relations. We don't say there's a China. And then Richard Nixon went in the early to mid 70s, and before you knew it, we recognized China. And I remember, my wife is sitting here in the front row. When that happened, I said to her, you know, of the few things we learned at the beginning about China, one of them was about acupuncture, needles. And I said to her, that's nuts. You know, and I'm not going to, because I've always had chronic pain in my back, I said, I'm not going to try acupuncture until somebody can prove it works. And her response was, they've been proving it for a few thousand years. So the Chinese have been up to a lot for a long time, and none of this should surprise us. Again, pretty good for a guy with 1.5 working knees, John Pomfret. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we're back with part 2 of night number 1. And it's about the trade war. And you can't really talk about China these days without talking about the trade war. If there's one prominent feature to the relationship in late 2018 and now into 2019, it is the trade war. And that's the key to the title of Brad Setzer's presentation tonight. Does anyone win a trade war? I want to ask you right now, yes or no?
No.
Okay, thank you for coming.
Sometimes it's still necessary to have a show of strength.
Okay. Why would we ask Brad to come here and talk about this? Well, he's a senior fellow for international economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. Before that, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Economic Analysis at the Department of the Treasury. How did you fit that on a business card?
Small print.
Small print, number 4 font. And before that, he was the Director for International Economics, serving jointly on the staff of the National Economic Council and the National Security Council. And other than that, Brad knows nothing about global economics. Broadly put, although he got to his career via Oxford and before that Harvard, Brad originally hails from Manhattan, Kansas. So he started as a neighbor of Colorado. He now lives in the other Manhattan. I don't remember what state that's in.
Montana.
No, he's a New Yorker now. You might find it interesting because you can tell from those job titles and the very fact that we invited him to talk about the trade war that Brad is pretty plugged in to issues like this. He's not so plugged into technology. He told me the other day that when he makes personal calls, he still makes them on a flip phone. Why?
It works.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Okay, Brad, before you talk about the big picture of trade wars, let me ask you what we used to call the $64,000 question, because I don't know if this will come up in your talk or not. We all know that China has invested heavily, and John made some reference to this, heavily in the United States and in the West in general, but primarily in the USA. So to what degree are their fortunes tied to ours, which would seem to mitigate the possibility that they're going to want to get into a real dispute that hurts us?
You know, I would flip that around a little bit, because I think China's fortunes depend far more on its exports to the U.S. than on its investments in the U.S. The investments in the U.S., if you think about equity-type investments, are still actually pretty small. There were a whole bunch of flashy real estate transactions a couple of years ago. There were bids which generally didn't succeed to buy some U.S. technology companies. But the bulk of China's whole investments in the U.S. are in U.S. treasuries. Those investments haven't been going up for the past 5 years. And I think China, and this is not a universally shared opinion, so it's a little bit of a provocative opinion. I think China, generally speaking, has been frustrated that it has never been able to effectively turn its holdings of treasuries into leverage over the United States. And I think you can interpret the Belt and Road and China's lending to other countries as an attempt to try to use its financial leverage where that financial leverage might have more of an impact. Because I don't think China's got that much out of its treasury holdings other than a weak currency 10 years ago, which did support its exports.
So the whole idea, and I've heard other people advance it, that China has replaced Japan. We all remember the Time magazine back in the day when it landed on most of your coffee tables, had the great headline, Japan Inc. I think it was sometime in the 80s, maybe even the late 70s. Japan Incorporated. So there's not a parallel with China then, that way, in terms of investment in America. Owning office buildings and land and so forth.
I mean, there's certainly a China Inc. The Chinese state is still owns the commanding heights of the Chinese economy in a way that the Japanese state didn't. Mm-hmm. And Huawei, which John said has links to the PLA, is technically a private company, but most people view that as part of China Inc. China Inc. though hasn't done what Japan did in the 1980s. It hasn't. Huawei hasn't set up large-scale factories in the U.S. to build Huawei equipment in the way that Toyota invested heavily in the U.S. auto sector. That's a conceivable future, but it's a future which would require settling the trade war, but I think also a broader set of questions around the security competition.
Okay, you mentioned the trade war. That's why you're here to talk. Does
Indeed.
anybody really win the trade war?
Well, the president clearly thinks so. One of his most famous quotes, I may also join John in standing up, is a little easier for me, is that trade wars are easy to win. That's a pretty easy statement to push back against. Trade wars typically are costly to fight and difficult to win. In order to win a trade war, you typically have to convince another country to change its economic policies. And it usually has adopted its economic policies because it thinks those economic policies are in its interest. Threats in international relations, and this is a classic insight, are costly when they fail and you have to carry them out. Tariffs are a tax on American consumption. China retaliates, that certainly hurt soybean exports, and tariffs clearly have had an impact on the stock market. Now, the president has argued that it's easy to win a trade war because the U.S. exports so little to China compared to how much it imports. So we could slap tariffs on I'm going to use the $600 billion number because that's what the current number is. Most people use the $500 billion number, which is like last year's number. So if I slip up, let me know. But that's kind of how much we import from China, and we export somewhere between 130 billion, which is the US number, 150 billion, which is the Chinese number, and 200 billion, which is the biggest number you get if you throw in everything we sell to both China and Hong Kong, because it seems pretty clear to me that a lot of the things we sell to Hong Kong don't stay in Hong Kong. So mechanically, we can tariff China more than China can tariff us. But we can't tariff China without also having some impact on our own economy. So I don't think the question is whether or not this is an easy fight. I think the question, the central question, is whether it is a necessary to fight. And I'm going to kind of try to argue that this is ultimately a fight over whether the terms of China's entry into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, back in 2001, provide the framework going forward for future trade between the US and China, or whether ultimately new terms are needed, different terms are needed. I think that's a question that will outlast the Trump administration. So I thought I would organize my remarks around three big questions. The first question is, how did we get here? What's the history? The second is, why did this trade war spring up now? I'm going to try to convince you that the answer isn't obvious, and that the simple answer, that Donald Trump won the election, is too simple. And then finally, I will give my thoughts on what may come next. So you could start back, I guess, when John Pomfret arrived in China in 1978 or in 1980, I think, when the US agreed, more or less, as part of the broader warming of relations with China, to apply the same tariffs on Chinese goods that we apply to pretty much all other countries except those countries where we have a free trade agreement. That's kind of the normal level of tariffs. That's a choice. China then was still communist. It wasn't a terribly open economy. But starting then, we applied the same tariffs to China that we applied to everyone else. We continued that after the Tiananmen Square events. But the seminal event in modern Sino-American economic relations is clearly China's accession into the WTO in 2001. So I'm going to start there. That firmly put China at the center of the global trading system. So I kind of went back and looked at some statistics to compare China's size then to China's size now. And since it's always hard to talk about numbers without context, I thought I would provide the obvious context, which is a comparison with the United States. So back in 2001, the US had an economy of roughly $10 trillion. Our economy today, $20 trillion. China's economy in 2001, little bigger than $1 trillion. So ballpark, somewhere between 1/8 and 1/10 of the size of the United States. China's economy now, close to 13 trillion, so an increase of a factor of 10. China's foreign exchange reserves, and China's holdings of treasuries are just a derivative of its holdings of foreign exchange, at that time were only 200 billion. It wasn't a big financial player in the global economy. The number today, 3 trillion. China's broadest trade surplus, very broadly defined, around 20 billion. Where it is now is a complicated question that we're going to come back to. China's exports and imports when it entered the WTO were in the range of 250 billion. Now they're in the range of 2.5 trillion. More exports than imports if you look at goods, but there are things other than goods, notably tourism and education. One thing that kind of surprised me when I went back and looked at it was that the US was actually a significantly more important, in relative terms, trading partner to China in 2001 than it is now. In 2001, The US accounted for between 40 and 50% of all China's goods exports, a bigger number than one would expect given our economic size, and that's now under 25%. So why has the WTO accession been so controversial? I think on the US side, when we agreed, and it was a bipartisan agreement, terms negotiated under Clinton, implemented under Bush, there was an expectation of three things. The first expectation was that China's WTO accession would only have a modest impact on the US. That's partially because economics has a dirty little secret, which is that for big economies like the US and China, trade is significantly less important economically than it looms in the political discourse. The bulk of our economy is us selling services to each other, not international trade. But it was also because we'd already been applying our standard tariff rates to trade with China for the preceding 20 years. The tariff rate wasn't really changing that much. So there was an expectation that the impact would be modest. The second expectation was that WTO entry would address successfully a number of long-standing US commercial concerns. Concerns about IPR theft, concerns about technology transfer. I assume everyone here knows who Robert Lighthizer is?
Maybe you better explain it.
He's the...
I'll raise my hand, I don't.
He's the United States trade representative, the leading trade warrior, so to speak. And he's been a longtime critic of China's WTO accession. So he went back and found a quote from President Clinton in the late 1990s saying that if China were let into the WTO, China could no longer require technology transfer when Americans invested in China. The third broad, I think, and this is controversial, expectation was that WTO accession, even though it was an economic decision, would have positive political spillovers, that it would lock China into a path indirectly that would ultimately lead to an expansion of political freedom inside China. Doesn't mean that there was an expectation that China would become a Jeffersonian democracy, to use the overused expression, but that the scope of political freedom would expand over time. If you want a soundbite, commerce was going to tame the Chinese Communist Party. I think it's fair to say that all three of those expectations proved less than true. First, and I'm going to take them in kind of the opposite order, I think there is a general consensus that President Xi has reduced the scope for political freedom and political expression inside China. Second, the reform of commercial practices inside China. Now, clearly there have been very significant changes inside China since 2001. A number of China's biggest, most successful state enterprises listed some of their shares on the stock exchange. They have private shareholders. But I think it is also fair to say that it's become clear that China's vision of state enterprise reform wasn't that the state enterprises would be privatized, but rather that the state enterprises would be modernized, become more profitable, and become more technologically sophisticated. I think there is near universal consensus that the technology transfer pressure continued. This is an important point because it seems to be something that is a subject of the current negotiations. When China agreed to join the WTO, it agreed that it could not, as a matter of central government policy, condition its approval of inward investment into China on technology transfer. Unambiguous commitment that was part of China's WTO agreement. However, China was and is under no obligation to allow US firms to invest freely inside China. So investment in many sectors can be conditioned on entering into a joint venture. Who are your typical joint venture partners? State firms. Can the state firm, as a matter of its own commercial judgment, require technology transfer as a condition for getting into the Chinese market? Of course. The best example here doesn't actually involve the United States. You guys probably don't spend most of your life on the Excella between Washington and New York. I do. It is not generally considered to be at the cutting edge of rail technology. However, when China decided to build out the biggest high-speed rail network that the world has ever seen, it asked the French, the Germans, the Japanese, and the Canadians to make their best offer. Tell us what you're going to do. And it forced, in effect, those firms to enter into joint ventures with Chinese state partners, because who ultimately buys railways in China? The Chinese state. Who approves the building of railways and finances them? The Chinese state. Who has all the cards? The Chinese state. So you sort of ended up having one version of high-speed rail in China that kind of looked a little bit like the German high-speed rail, and another version that looked a little bit like the Japanese high-speed rail. And then after 5 or 6 years, those guys kind of like, well, the Chinese decided they digested the technology and no longer needed to pay that much in royalty because it had been re-innovated, was Chinese. And so today, the high-speed rail producers globally get very little intellectual property revenue out of China and export almost nothing, no parts, to China. All done within the rubric of the WTO. But unquestionably, the topic that generates the most passion, the most discussion, including amongst economists, was how China's WTO accession impacted the United States. One of the most famous modern economic papers is a paper by 3 economists, Otto, Dorn, and Hansen. And they had a very clever idea. They said, in order to assess how trade with China has impacted different parts of the United States, we're going to look, in the first instance, at those sectors where China is exporting a lot more to Europe after the WTO, on the assumption that that would be this independent variable that wasn't tied to anything that was going on in the US. It was something more tied to the WTO and to China. And then would look and see what happened in those parts of the US which had the most industrial production in those sectors. And what they concluded was that those parts of the US did much worse than the rest of the US. That ballpark, there was a loss of about 1 million manufacturing jobs in those regions, and that another 1 million or so jobs in those regions disappeared. Now, that conclusion has been challenged, questioned, but in my view, it holds up relatively well. I have a really simple, stupid, easy technique for estimating the dislocations associated with trade. In general, an increase in imports or an increase of exports should be worth, over time, about 1 million jobs. That's what you get from the US government statistics about jobs supported by exports, so it's a kind of straightforward calculation. It also basically fits with common sense. The total US labor force is about then it was 125 million, now it's 150. Manufacturing tends to be more productive, so 1% of GDP would account for, in manufacturing and traded sectors, would account for a little less than 1% of total jobs. And since when, contrary to what some have argued, but I'm quite confident on this point, the increase in imports from China wasn't offset by decreased imports from other places, at least in the first instance. Therefore, it sort of seems not surprising that there would be a negative impact on employment and on the communities where that competition was most intense. But I also think it is important to recognize that not all increases in imports are created equal. Imports rose significantly in the late 1990s during the dot-com boom. Imports are going up of manufacturers quite rapidly now. The impact in the 2000s was intense, in my view, because it came at a time when the US economy was weak. We were working through the legacy of the dot-com crisis. And the US, in particular the manufacturing sector, really needed the support that would come by increasing exports. And we ended up having the opposite effect. That, though, doesn't mean that there aren't benefits from trade. Imports from China increase the profits of many US firms. Apple makes more money contracting to have its phones built in China than it would making them in Mexico. Cisco, even though Huawei stole its technology, still makes its routers mostly in China, increasing its profit margins. And consumers benefit. And when consumers benefit because they have cheaper goods, they have more money to spend on other things. Ski vacations, for example. The impact, at least in my view, is important not because of the aggregate effects on the economy were particularly large, but because they were regionally concentrated. Not all parts of the US were as exposed. The impact was strongest in the upper Midwest and in the Carolinas, Georgia, Kentucky, the manufacturing parts of the US. There was a second China shock, which was the shock to our financial markets, the big increase in China's treasury purchases. That's kind of my specialty, and I have two great insights into this. The first of which I don't believe I've gotten sufficient credit for. When everyone thought China was buying treasuries, they were actually buying more agencies, Freddie and Fannie bonds. And Treasury sort of became shorthand for a broader purchase of US bonds. The second point is that if you go back and look at the period when China was buying the most, the Treasury wasn't actually issuing that many bonds. The fiscal deficit had fallen quite a lot by 2007. So our fiscal deficit was only like 150 billion. And China, even though it wasn't just buying treasuries, its reserves were going up by an incredible 500, 600 billion a year. It was basically buying up all the new treasuries being issued. And more generally, it was pulling safe assets out of the US economy. And how did the US economy and financial system respond? Well, we created what we thought were safe assets, mortgage-backed securities. They didn't turn out to be so safe, and you can say the rest is history. There isn't consensus, to be clear, about the impact of competition with imports with China on the US labor market. There's a debate. But I think it is generally accepted that the 2000s were a really good decade for China and a pretty bad decade for the US. Raises an obvious question. Why is the trade war happening now rather than back when the China shock was at its most intense? Paul Krugman, I know he's kind of controversial, but he's a pretty good trade economist. He had an interesting analogy. He said that if an auto hits a pedestrian and runs them over, you don't make the pedestrian better by putting the car into reverse and rolling the back over them. And you can certainly say that those workers who lost their jobs because of competition with China in the textile sector in 2002 aren't getting those jobs back just because of the new tariffs. So one way in which the timing is a little strange is that the China shock, by most measures, isn't as intense as it once was. It's mostly, for now, in the past. Second, China's global trade surplus has actually kind of come down relative to the size of its economy. Now, it's a little bit of a strange adjustment. China's manufacturing surplus is as big as it has ever been. It's still close to $1 trillion. So the manufacturing side, there's still an impact. But China imports an awful lot of commodities. And as we've discussed, Chinese tourists and Chinese students traveling abroad are a very major force around the world. So when you factor those in, the bulk of China's manufacturing surplus now goes to buy commodities and vacations. It's not quite what it once was. And finally, my traditional concern that China was artificially intervening in the foreign exchange market to keep its currency from appreciating, hence all the purchases of treasuries and agencies, has receded. China is no longer a big buyer of treasuries and agencies, and to the extent that China is intervening in the foreign exchange market, now, because its own economy is a little weak, it's to push its currency up, not to hold it down. So the easy answer for why now is Donald Trump won an election. But I think that's too easy. Trump's critique of trade with China and the broader economic relationship has resonated in a way that his other criticism of trade has not. I think President Trump is pretty much alone, even in his own administration, in thinking that the US faces a real security threat from trade with Canada. So why now? First, I think it is in part, as John talked about, because of President Xi and the mistakes he's made. President for life kind of gets rid of any hope of change. Second, I think China has converged technologically before it has converged economically or politically in its institutions. Huawei is generally believed to be at the cutting edge of producing fifth-generation telecommunications networks. China has mastered the manufacturing of a lot of renewables technology. And China certainly aspires to reach the cutting edge in semiconductors, medical equipment, aviation, and artificial intelligence. The odds are it will do so before its economic institutions resemble our own. Unlike in the 2000s, when only US workers were scared by trade with China, and US firms generally viewed it as an opportunity, whether to lower cost or to export to China, many US firms are now concerned. And then finally, I think there's been a loss of confidence that the WTO provides a sufficient framework for addressing those concerns. We've discussed the limits of China's commitment on technology transfer. There are also relatively few restraints on China's ability to subsidize its own domestic industry. And China, because it has a state banking system, a state-led, certain sectors economy, can generally speaking subsidize on a unique scale. And it obviously hasn't gotten rid of the overt industrial espionage. There's a sense, and some people think this is good, that it has done more to constrain the US, because it has constrained our tariffs, than it has done to constrain China's industrial policy. And I think there is no longer a sense that in order to succeed in the global economy, China has to change its domestic institutions. There's a possibility that China could succeed as it is, and a sense that the WTO is not strong enough to force China to change. So what's next? We put tariffs at 25% on 50 billion of imports. We put tariffs at 10% on 200 billion of imports. There's somewhere between 250 and 300 billion left to tariff. The impact, I think, goes up as you expand the scope of the tariffs, largely because you're tariffing things that the US isn't realistically going to produce. The stupid, dumb, but not necessarily wrong way of viewing the tariffs is to look at the kind of just pay it price on the tariffs. And if you do that, going to 25% on all trade with China relative to where we are now would be about $100 billion change. 25 billion of tariffs to 125 billion of tariffs, half a point of our GDP, big enough, almost certainly, to slow the economy down, obviously impacts the stock market. On the other side, China has made, I think, a pretty clear offer. It's willing to buy more soybeans, more LNG, more oil, more wheat, more beef. It is willing to lift the joint venture requirement in some sectors. Tesla got to build its own factory. It is willing to strengthen IPR enforcement for Chinese technologies, tech innovations, as well as some others. And it is willing to make it the China 2025 program less in your face. Get rid of 25 as a target, generally not talk about it so much. It now looks like the president is willing to do this deal. That's my read on the recent chain of tweets. I often say the most important indicator for the stock market is whether Trump is tweeting more about how he's going to do a great deal with China or whether he's tweeting that tariffs are great. The key question, if that's right, is what will this deal be? Will it be a peace or will it be a truce? My guess is a truce. So I want to conclude by laying out what I think are the tough issues going forward. Right now we have one system of rules, the WTO, for two very different economic systems. There's an argument that because tariffs are self-defeating, we should go back to that. That argument, and I think it's a fair argument, suggests that the benefits we get from trade from China come predominantly from the ability to access the genius of China's manufacturing technology to lower our own cost. We don't really care that much about whether or not Saudi Arabia rigs its internal market in a way that hurts us, so long as Saudi Arabia sells us their oil cheaply. Yeah, I know things have changed. Oil's a little different. We produce more. We're not going to be an importer in a couple of years. But I think that gives a sense in which the argument goes that developments, how China manages its own economy, isn't central to the benefits of trade. Different systems can trade successfully. Alternative argument is that two different systems require two different rules, which would imply ultimately either developing rules for trade with everyone other than China that China is not allowed into, the TPP plus TTIP alternative, or moving trade with China off WTO terms. Personally, and this is where I sort of disagree a little bit with John, I don't think the delta, the difference between the general level of tariffs and the zero tariffs that you get in a free trade agreement is enough to significantly change the trading relationship with China. So I'm not sure that would be sufficient. The third alternative, which is where I suspect we will end up, is we'll split the difference. There will be sectors where we trade with China on the same terms as everyone else, and sectors where we don't. Telecommunications equipment being the most obvious example. And I'll stop there.
And he did all that without a calculator. Okay, you really just began to answer the question I want to ask you first. Ultimately, if there's to be a deal, who's going to have to give up what? What's the United States going to have to, maybe there's a parallel to the shutdown and the conflict between the Democrats and the Republicans. Trump says, I won't reopen the government without funding for the wall. The Democrats say, we won't make a deal without a permanent solution for the Dreamers, et cetera. What's the parallel in the conflict with China over trade?
So I think there has been a shift in the Chinese position. I think the Chinese are willing to make the changes that I outlined, buy more stuff, commit to buy more stuff, make it a little easier for some companies to invest inside China, scale back the most egregious, or at least downplay the most egregious aspects of China 2025 without requiring the US change very many policies. But China probably wants us to roll back our tariffs. So in order to get a deal, the most expansive version of a deal, I suspect we would have to commit to go back to WTO terms for most trade with China. The question is whether we would have to go back all the way back or whether we would retain some tariffs.
If China's economy weren't softening as we understand it is, and that precedes the beginning of the tariff war, do you believe China would be ready to make these compromises?
I think it's the weakness of China's. So Trump did pick a moment in time when China's economy was weakening, and when your economy is weakening, you generally want to export more. Sort of pretty straightforward. So in that sense, I think the timing has added to the pressure on Xi to make concessions. On the other hand, I think several of the concessions are things that China has always been willing to give. China has always been willing to buy US LNG. The question is whether we wanted to sell US LNG to China or wanted to solidify relationships in Europe. China has always been willing to commit to buy soybeans. It doesn't grow enough on its own. So I think that there's sort of a mix of the two.
So in your opinion, was actually first candidate Trump and then President Trump on firm ground with respect to his complaints about China? He was complaining even during the campaign about intellectual data issues, about the currency manipulation, about the deficit where we buy more from them than they buy from us. As John said before you, maybe that doesn't matter all that much. But was he standing on firm ground? Is he right about their violations of the norms?
I'm going to be your kind of classic two-handed economist and say yes and no. The no was he complained that China was manipulating his currency when China was no longer manipulating his currency. The no is that Trump believes the bilateral balance is the only relevant measure for the benefits from trade. In a world where if trade were completely fair, we would almost certainly run a surplus with Australia, Australia would run a surplus with China, and we would run a deficit with China. Where I think Trump was on solid ground is that the concerns about technology transfer are very real. The concerns that China isn't playing fair, is trying to drive, say, Micron, a semiconductor firm, out of business so it would be cheaper for China's state to buy. I think that's real. And I think there is a real question about whether an economy where the state plays a different role. There aren't really private Chinese banks. The commanding heights of the Chinese economy are state firms, and China is trying to leverage that into technological leadership and to displace US exports of things like aircraft. I think those are legitimate issues.
Well, expanding on that, with respect to the complaints the United States makes about China, what complaints could China make about us?
We don't well, first of all, we don't buy Huawei equipment.
We don't buy what?
Huawei telecommunications equipment.
Their telecommunications.
Right?
system.
Huawei's a really big deal. Right? It is the most globally successful Chinese firm. It is close to being at the technological cutting edge. I think it is viewed as on the par with Ericsson, the Swedish firm. It kind of has built out the telecommunications networks of much of the world, including much of Eastern Europe, just not the US. And it's now making pretty good smartphones, which are taking market share from everyone, including Apple. And by the way, China wants to use its position to help it build a domestic semiconductor industry, because Huawei has done this by importing some US technology, some US semiconductors, and China is worried that the US could impose a death sentence on Huawei by blocking the export of those technologies. So China either wants us to commit not to do that or to develop its own technology. It would like to, I mentioned that the Excella could be a little better than it is now. China's quite happy to finance and build a new high-speed rail line between DC and Boston. China would like to buy more LNG, and then China would like us, their traditional concern is that we restrict technology exports too aggressively to China. Those are kind of their traditional ask.
One more question before we go back to the audience. If this thing persists, this trade war, and our relationship, economically at least, deteriorates, can we replace China as a supplier of both imported goods for the consumer and for industry? And likewise, the question is, could they replace us?
I'll give the yes and no answer. Yes, with 10 years. No, on a shorter time horizon.
For both, going both ways.
In 10 years, India could become a center for building iPhones. Well, most of the components for iPhones aren't produced inside China, they're produced in Taiwan and Korea. In 10 years, Mexico could build all of our furniture. But that won't happen in a year. We could adjust our economy so we produce fewer soybeans or use more of the soybeans we do produce domestically. But in the short run, without the Chinese market, the soybeans are just piling up in the Midwest, not being shipped anywhere. So with time, we could, but it'd be costly. And there's a longer run opportunity cost because it'd be a technologically fragmented world. And it'd be a world where US firms wouldn't sell as much in China, wouldn't get profits. But, can China completely replace us? No. Until China can build its own aircraft and build its own semiconductors, they're stuck.
I thought they do build their own aircraft.
No wide bodies, and the C919 has yet to enter commercial service. But it's a real issue. Mm-hmm. They don't yet produce processors that are comparable to those made by Intel. Obviously, Huawei's cell phones run on an Android operating system, which is ultimately a US technology. So,
by the way, you made reference to, just briefly, to a few other powers in Asia, and that's going to be a part of the talk, the first part of tomorrow night's presentation with Johanna Gao, who will talk about more of Asia than just China. In the audience, where is the microphone?
And I don't answer questions on what will happen to the stock market.
I won't ask one then. At a macro level, assuming you're correct that sometime in 2019 we arrive at this truce, the dust settles, things begin to become more clear. At a macro level, is our economy going to be better off than it was or worse off than it was?
In the short run, better off. The escalation of the tariffs that has been threatened in March would unquestionably hurt us. In the short run, there is no, particularly on the expanded list, there are no realistic alternatives to Chinese supply. Be tariffing clothing imports, be tariffing cell phones, computers. So there'd just be an increase in prices, and that would be a drag on the US economy. Long run, I think that gets at the debate about whether China's policies are so egregious that we have to force change or not. And whether or not some subset of the measures that have been taken so far, plus bringing cases, legal cases on IPR infringement against Huawei and others, could achieve the same goals. But in the short run, the escalation of the tariffs would hurt the US economy. And I assume that the president, for all of his bluster, understands that, which is part of the reason why he seems more keen on a deal.
When this ends as you predict, I'm right here in the second row.
Oh, sorry, the lights are bright. So.
If this ends in a truce as you predict, will that truce have the impact of increasing the possibility of a broader, more comprehensive agreement in the future, or does it diminish that possibility?
I don't think it diminishes it. I don't think it significantly increases it either. I think the key element of a truce, in some sense, would be that China goes back to buying soybeans, resumes its imports of oil, and expands that, buys wheat, which it hasn't traditionally, buys beef, which it has always promised to buy, but never has gotten around to buy, so forth and so on. But what it won't do is, and that over time will, the more people in the U.S. who feel their livelihoods depend on exporting to China, the higher the cost of disrupting the relationship. So that, if it's successful, would expand the constituencies. What I don't see is an expansion of the constituencies to address the concerns of the more manufacturing-centric parts of the U.S. economy. And so I think the long-run possibility of a true deal centers around those sectors where China is aggressively pursuing policies that would have the effect of displacing U.S. exports, manufactured exports. I mean, aircraft, medical equipment, and semiconductors are at the heart of the modern manufacturing economy. And if China doesn't want to buy them, I don't see how you end up with a permanent settlement or deal.
Over there.
So is there any tariff that you could imagine that would actually create more jobs in the United States? So they're being used, Trump believes that that's the low-cost manufacturing overseas is what's deteriorated the jobs in the United States. And also, is there any way that you see of creating more technology jobs in the United States? Because we didn't actually ever lose those, we just never created them because they all were being done in China and Asia.
I think tariffs can create jobs in individual sectors. So if you protect steel, you're going to end up with more steel jobs. It is harder to get a big impact across the economy for two reasons. The first is other countries respond with tariffs of their own, and those hurt our exports. The second is that we speak of tariffs in isolation. We haven't discussed how currencies move, and the movements in currencies can offset the impacts of tariffs. That kind of happened to some degree over the summer when China's currency depreciated as we increased our tariffs. What could we do to increase the number of good manufacturing jobs in the US? I have a pretty clear set of answers to that. Part of it and this is, I know, wildly controversial. People think I'm crazy. I reveal my political colors. We need to tax the transfer, the offshoring of intellectual property in a way that we don't now. Our tax code before and our tax code now effectively allows you to get the lowest possible tax rate if you don't manufacture in the US. You put your intellectual property at a low price in Bermuda, you license that to a plant in Ireland. If you license it back to the US, you wouldn't get the same tax treatment. And then the plant in Ireland does the production. I think that's a really quite significant self-created distortion. We run a trade deficit in pharmaceutical products that is almost as big as our trade surplus in aircraft. And we've got good pharma companies. They just don't produce in the US. I think there's something similar that's impacting semiconductor manufacturing. I also think we probably have to treat semiconductor manufacturing as a strategic industry, and if necessary, subsidize it so that we win in the technological competition with China. What we haven't talked about are countries other than China, Germany, and I think Germany doesn't need to run a fiscal surplus of 2% of its GDP. It could have a balanced budget, which would mean it would spend about 2% more than it does now. And if other countries with really big surpluses did the same, we would export more. I think that would help too.
In your opinion, if America didn't use the tariff penalty, what other tools in the toolbox do we have to have made China come to the table and not steal our intellectual properties?
Investment restrictions, I think, are one. The WTO, as I mentioned, didn't restrict China's ability to limit inward investment into China. It also doesn't really restrict our ability to limit investment from China here in the US. So that's a point of leverage. We could pursue WTO cases, which are WTO consistent. The remedy in WTO cases is ultimately tariffs, so it's a little bit more complicated, but it would be a different avenue. We could restrict exports of some technologies and otherwise penalize Chinese IPR theft. There's been a much more aggressive approach to bringing politically difficult legal enforcement cases against China in the past year.
IPR stands for?
Sorry, intellectual property rights.
Rights, okay. Where is that microphone?
So, it's over here. So how rational do you think our trade policies with China are? And is there somebody within the government who is looking at the bigger picture? For example, it would seem to me that we are putting ourselves in a weaker position with the government shutdown, which is now impacting our economy in significant ways that we may not be able to afford to undertake a further impact from a trade war.
I agree with your point on the shutdown. I think we made a mistake by escalating the trade war too rapidly and threatening things that we don't really want to do, which also has weakened our leverage. I am willing to consider that if China is going to be, if we know China has a policy of displacing our future exports of medical equipment to China, we should front run the formal legal process and say, well, we're going to start restricting a narrow subset of imports today in order to get leverage over those Chinese policies. But I think we went too far too fast, weren't targeted enough, and we are in other ways shooting ourselves in the foot, shutdown being the most obvious case.
Do you know, Brad, or even see signs that there is much going on under the radar to fix this problem, to create that truce?
I mean, I don't think it's under the radar right now. It's pretty much, the Wall Street Journal reports on the latest dialogue between the U.S. and China pretty much every day. There is a process ahead of the March 1st deadline. That's when we've threatened to do 25% on the 10%, the second tranche of tariffs, and go to 25% tariffs potentially on everything. There's clearly an intensified process of interaction, might call it a negotiation, that started with the Buenos Aires summit in November, and it has continued. In some sense, my concern is that it's a little bit insufficiently under the radar, in the sense that every time Trump treats that he thinks he's going to do a great deal, that's not the classic negotiating strategy for maximizing your leverage ahead of March.
We have time for one more question, otherwise...
If not you, then me. Anybody have a question?
Okay, go ahead, Greg.
Okay, my question is this. Some of this depends on the state of China's economy. You yourself said that, because it's softening that makes them a little more eager to deal. Fair enough?
Yeah.
That being the case, their economy, isn't it likely to soften even more because of the massive environmental problems to which John Pomfret referred when he was speaking, meaning air. If you've been, how many have been to China? Almost everybody. Well, you know, I mean, it is beyond acceptable. And their soil, and their water, and it's all a consequence of their industrial revolution. Every nation that's gone through one, and there aren't all that many, ultimately has to pay the piper, and they're in the midst of doing it now. I have read figures in the trillions of dollars. The Chinese government has acknowledged that they've got to spend massive amounts of money. What impact, as an economist I'm asking you, what impact do you expect that to have on China and its economy, and thus its relationship with the American economy?
Two. One, when China shuts a steel factory or shuts a coal mine, that's what you kind of have to do to get the air, make the air cleaner. It hurts the parts of China that produce coal and produce steel. And it is a drag on China's economy in the short run. You can try to offset it. China has a plan. And the plan is to become, part of it's going to help us. They want to, one way you can reduce your burning coal is to burn more gas. It's cleaner, which means importing more gas. And we're pretty good at producing gas at a low price, and it's kind of costly to ship it all the way to China. But, China, the right price, it works.
And we're building the ports to do it.
And China is good and willing to finance them, provide the technology, you name it. And then China is investing heavily in renewables and in electric vehicles. That has a more mixed effect, I think, on the US. You could imagine that China's electric vehicle initiative makes China the world leader at producing electric cars in the way that it is at producing a lot of other electronics. And if we at some future point shift our economy towards electric vehicles, we may be behind.
Well, thank you, Brad Setzer. It all comes full circle to how you answered my very first question. Nobody wins. Thank you very much.